A single blow was enough for the Tsar of all the Russias to destroy his dynasty with his own hands. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The night of the 25th of November 1581 was marked in Russian history with imperial blood. In a room of the Moscow palace, a 51-year-old man raised his iron scepter against his own son. The blow echoed against the stone walls. The heir to the throne fell to the ground, blood staining the Persian rugs. Tsar Ivan Vasilyevich fell to his knees next to the dying body of Ivan Ivanovich, screaming with a desperation that chilled the blood of all the servants. But it was already too late. The 27-year-old boy, the future of Russia, would die days later. And the father who had killed him would spend the rest of his life dragging himself through the halls of the Kremlin, crying, praying, banging his head against the floor until it bled, begging for a forgiveness that would never come. But this story does not begin with that blow. It begins decades earlier, in the same palace, with another child. A child who also bled, but whose wounds no one bandaged. Russia in the 16th century was not the empire it would become centuries later. It was a fractured mosaic of principalities, disputed territories, endless forests where wolves howled louder than church bells. The Grand Principality of Moscow had managed to free itself from the Mongol yoke only decades before, but freedom did not bring peace. It brought a power vacuum. And in that vacuum, human wolves were more dangerous than those in the forest. On the 3rd of December 1530, in a room of the Kremlin barely lit by tallow candles, Ivan was born. His father, Basil III, Grand Prince of Moscow, was already 47 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, only 20. The marriage had been scandalous. Basil had locked his first wife in a convent for not giving him heirs, defying the laws of the Orthodox Church. But he needed a son. Power without an heir was an invitation to chaos. Ivan came into the world amid thunderclaps, according to chronicles. The priests saw in this an omen, but they failed to interpret it correctly. For 3 years, the boy grew protected. He had a powerful father, a young and ambitious mother. He seemed destined to inherit a growing kingdom. But in 1533, Basil III died from an infection after a hunt. The wound on his leg became gangrenous. The doctors could do nothing. According to some testimonies, the Grand Prince died in convulsions and screams, cursing the boyars who were already planning how to divide power. Ivan was 3 years old when he last saw his father. Elena Glinskaya assumed the regency. She was a strong-willed woman, prepared to defend her son's throne against the nobility who despised her for being foreign and a woman. For 5 years she ruled with a firm hand, allying with some boyar clans against others, executing conspirators, strengthening the walls of Moscow. But in 1538, she suddenly fell ill. The symptoms were violent: vomiting, convulsions, darkening skin. She died within days. Poison. Everyone knew it, although no one dared say it aloud. Ivan was 8 years old when he lost his mother. And then the real hell began. The boyars, those noble families who had served the princes of Moscow for generations, plunged themselves into the fight for power like vultures on a corpse. The Shuaysky, Belsky, and Glinsky families disputed control over the boy who was, technically, the Grand Prince. But no one paid him honors. No one protected him. They used him as a seal, as a symbol, as an excuse for their own ambitions. Ivan lived the following years in a kind of gilded abandonment. He inhabited the largest palace in Russia, but went hungry. He wore princely clothes, but torn and dirty. The boyars organized banquets in the Kremlin halls, drank until dawn, shouted at each other, sometimes resorting to arms. The boy wandered among them like a ghost. Sometimes they called him to sign a document he did not understand. Other times, they completely ignored him. He witnessed coups. He saw a noble push another down the stairs during an argument. He heard servants being tortured on suspicions of loyalty to this or that faction. One night, armed men burst into his rooms looking for a member of the Glinsky clan who had taken refuge near the boy. They dragged the man out while Ivan screamed. No one comforted him afterward. The Shuiskys dominated for years. Prince Andrei Shuaysky behaved like the true ruler. He slept in the imperial chambers. He sat on the throne during audiences. When Ivan protested or cried, they locked him in his rooms. sometimes for whole days. Hunger was constant. The rations belonging to him as Grand Prince were diverted. The cooks served the boyars first. Ivan learned to steal food from the kitchens, to hide in the halls so as not to be seen, so as not to receive blows or insults. But something grew inside him. It was not just fear. It was hatred. A cold, patient hatred that fed on every humiliation. Ivan was intelligent. He learned to read voraciously. Russian chronicles, the lives of saints, the histories of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. He devoured books as if they were his only real food. And in those pages, he found something the boyars never gave him, a vision of what a ruler should be. Not a toy, not a symbol, an autocrat, a czar, an emperor whose word was absolute law. He began to take mental notes. Which boyar had humiliated him? Who had hit him? Who had laughed when he was hungry? He kept every name in his memory as if they were debts to be collected. At 13 years old, something happened that changed everything. In December 1543, during a meeting of the Boyar Council, Prince Andrei Shuaysky again ignored Ivan's words. The boy had tried to give an opinion on a matter of the kingdom. Shuaysky laughed. Other boyars too. They treated Ivan like the child they still thought he was. But Ivan was no longer that child. He left the room silently. He summoned his personal guards, the few who answered directly to him. And that very night, they arrested Andrei Shuaysky. There was no trial, no debate. The prince was thrown into the dungeons and, according to chronicles, delivered to the hunting dogs. They tore him apart alive. The silence that followed in the Kremlin was total. The boyars understood the message. The boy had grown up and had fangs. At 16 years old, Ivan decided he needed more than the title of Grand Prince. He needed a title that resonated with the weight of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the great empires he had read about in books. On the 16th of January 1547, Ivan Vasilyevich was crowned in the Cathedral of the Assumption, but not as prince, as Tsar. The term derived from Caesar. It was a declaration. Russia was not just another principality. It was an empire, and he was not a noble among nobles. He was the absolute emperor. The ceremony was grand. The Orthodox metropolitans placed the monomac crown on his head. Ivan vowed to defend the Orthodox faith, protect his people, expand the borders of the kingdom. It seemed the beginning of a golden era, and for a time it was. The early years of Ivan's reign were truly remarkable. He convened the Zemsky Sobor, an assembly of representatives from different social strata, a sort of primitive parliament. He reformed the legal code, creating the Sudebnik of 1550, which modernized the judicial system and limited some abuses by the boyars. He organized the army, creating the Streltsy, the first permanent infantry regiments armed with firearms in Russia. And he conquered. In 1552, Ivan personally led the siege of Kazan, capital of the Tatar Khanate that had been a thorn in Russia's side for decades. The city fell after weeks of bombardment. Ivan ordered the construction of the Cathedral of St. Basil in Moscow to commemorate the victory. Its colorful domes became a symbol of Russia. For years later, he conquered Astrakhan. Control of the Volga was total. Trade routes to Persia and the Caspian Sea were opened. Russia expanded eastward, towards Siberia, towards vast territories that would multiply its size. Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna, a young woman from the Zakarian Yuriev family. The marriage was, surprisingly, happy. Anastasia was sweet, devout, intelligent. According to several testimonies, she had a calming influence on Ivan. When he grew furious, she managed to soothe him. She gave him 6 children, although only 2 survived infancy. For 13 years, Anastasia was the anchor keeping Ivan connected to his humanity. But in 1560, Anastasia fell ill. The symptoms were similar to Elena Glinskaya's decades earlier. Vomiting, fever, agony. She died on the 7th of August. Ivan went mad. He was convinced she had been poisoned. He accused the boyars, the noble families who, according to him, had never accepted that a woman of relatively minor family had so much influence over the Tsar. He demanded investigations, arrests, tortures, but he never found conclusive evidence, because maybe there was none, or perhaps the guilty were too powerful to be touched. Anastasia's death broke something inside Ivan. The man who had been, at his best moments, a visionary reformer, began to transform into the monster history would remember. The Tsar, who had learned in his childhood that power without cruelty was weakness, stopped restraining his darkest impulses, and Russia began to bleed. In 1564, Ivan did something unprecedented. He abandoned Moscow. He simply left, with his family, his treasury, his religious icons. He settled in Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, a fortress 100 kilometers from the capital. From there, he sent 2 letters. The first, to the people of Moscow, said he remained their protective Tsar. The second, to the boyars and clergy, accused them of treason, corruption, conspiracy, and announced his abdication. The panic was immediate. Without a Tsar, Russia would disintegrate. The terrified boyars sent delegations begging for his return. Ivan accepted, but with conditions. He demanded absolute power to punish traitors. No trials, no appeals, total authority over life and death. And the boyars, desperate, accepted. That was when Ivan created the Oprichnina. He divided Russia into 2. The Oprichnina, territory under his direct control, and the Zemshchina, the rest. He created a special guard corps, the Oprichniks, dressed entirely in black, riding black horses. They carried on their saddles symbols of a broom and a dog's head. The broom to sweep away treason, the dog to sniff it out. The Oprichniks answered to no one but the Tsar. They could arrest, torture, execute anyone without need for evidence. A suspicion was enough. A rumor, an anonymous denunciation. Terror became institutionalized. Entire boyar families were arrested. Their properties confiscated. Some executed publicly in Red Square. Others simply vanished. The Oprichniks looted houses, raped women, killed servants. And no one could stop them. Ivan personally participated in the interrogations, designed tortures, watched executions. Some historians suggest he took pleasure in it. Others argue it was a calculated display of power, showing that no life was beyond his reach. The line between justice and sadism became invisible. Prince Vladimir of Staritsa, Ivan's cousin and a possible alternative heir, was accused of conspiracy. Probably falsely. He was forced to drink poison along with his entire family. His mother, Princess Ephrasinia, died first. Vladimir followed her. His children as well. Metropolitan Philip, leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, dared to publicly criticize the atrocities of the Oprichnina. Ivan had him arrested during a mass. Philip was strangled in his cell. But the massacre of Novgorod was the peak of horror. In 1569, Ivan received reports that Novgorod, Russia's second most important city, was planning to ally with Poland-Lithuania. The reports were doubtful, possibly fabricated. But Ivan did not need certainties. He needed examples. In January 1570, the Tsar marched to Novgorod with his army of Oprichniks. They surrounded the city. No one could enter or leave. For 5 weeks, the Oprichniks ravaged Novgorod. The chronicles speak of thousands of dead. Some modern historians estimate between 3,000 and 15,000 victims. Men, women, children. It did not matter. Entire families were thrown into the Fokhov River, tied so they could not swim. Those who tried to escape were pierced with spears on the banks. Ivan supervised personally. He interrogated nobles, merchants. He tortured them to obtain confessions of betrayals that never existed. Then ordered their executions. Monasteries looted. Churches desecrated. The wealth of Novgorod, accumulated for centuries as a commercial center, was stolen and taken to Moscow. When he finally withdrew, Novgorod was a ghost town. And the message was clear to all Russia: defy the Tsar, real or imagined, and face total annihilation. But terror did not just destroy Ivan's enemies. It destroyed Russia itself. The economy collapsed. Peasants fled the lands, seeking refuge in remote regions where the Oprichniks did not reach. Agriculture collapsed. Hunger spread. Constant wars. Ivan had started the Livonian War, a 25-year conflict against Poland-Lithuania, Sweden, and the Teutonic Order, drained resources and men. Russia, which Ivan wanted to turn into a powerful empire, was bleeding out. And inside the Kremlin, the Tsar became increasingly erratic. He married 7 times after Anastasia's death. No wife lasted long. Some died under suspicious circumstances. Others were sent to convents. Ivan desperately sought to recreate the happiness he had known with Anastasia. But he only found emptiness. His paranoia grew. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He stopped trusting his counselors. He executed some of the men who had served him loyally for decades. Andrei Kurbsky, one of his brightest generals, fled to Poland and from there wrote letters accusing Ivan of tyranny. Ivan responded with very long epistles, defending every action, every execution, every act of cruelty as necessary to preserve order. But his own words revealed the chasm in his mind. In 1581, Ivan was 51 years old. He was physically deteriorated. Years of excess, stress, probable venereal diseases had prematurely aged him. He suffered constant pains. His temper was even more explosive. His son Ivan Ivanovich, heir to the throne, was a capable man, married and expecting his own heir. But tensions between father and son had grown. The young Ivan sometimes questioned his father's decisions, and the old Tsar would not tolerate questioning. On the 25th of November, father and son argued. Sources vary on the reason. Some say it was because of the Livonian War. Others that Ivan the Terrible struck his son's pregnant wife for dressing inappropriately, and the young Ivan defended his wife. Others suggest the argument was about politics, about the future of the kingdom. What is certain is that Ivan Vasilyevich, in a fit of rage, raised his iron-tipped scepter and struck his son on the head. The young man fell. Blood gushed from the wound. Ivan the Terrible immediately fell to his knees. He screamed, called doctors, held his son, staining himself with blood, begging for forgiveness. The young Ivan survived for days, agonizing. The best doctors were summoned, but the wound was severe. Infection was inevitable. He died on the 19th of November, and with him, the Rurik dynasty died, because Ivan's other son, Fyodor, was mentally and physically weak, incapable of ruling. Ivan the Terrible spent his last years in a spiral of guilt and madness. He banged his head against the floor praying, tore his hair out, cried for hours, tried to abdicate several times, considered becoming a monk, but he never really relinquished power. He died on the 28th of March 1584 while playing chess. Some testimonies say he suffered a stroke, others that he was poisoned. It will never be known for sure. He was buried in the Archangel Michael Monastery in the Kremlin. His simple tomb contrasts with the magnitude of his reign. Fyodor inherited the throne. But in reality, Boris Godunov, his brother-in-law, ruled. When Fyodor died without heirs in 1598, the Rurik dynasty officially ended. Russia entered the time of troubles, years of civil war, foreign invasions, false claimants to the throne. The chaos Ivan so feared, that he tried to prevent with his reign of terror, broke out precisely because his terror had destroyed the structures that could have stopped it. The question persists through the centuries. Was Ivan the Terrible an innate monster or a product of his circumstances? Historians are divided. Some argue that his traumatic childhood, the abandonment, the constant violence he witnessed, the total lack of affection except for Anastasia, created a man incapable of trust, obsessed with control, willing to commit any atrocity to avoid being vulnerable again. Others point out that many rulers had difficult childhoods and did not become genocidal tyrants. That Ivan had choices. That he chose cruelty. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Ivan grew up in a world where compassion was perceived as weakness, where the boyars around him resolved disputes with murder and poison, where power was not won with laws, but with fear. He learned those lessons too well. And when he had absolute power, he applied those lessons without limit. But the system he created did not survive his death. The Oprichnina was dissolved. The policies of terror left Russia weakened, not strengthened. The positive reforms of his early years were buried under mountains of corpses. His legacy is complex. On one hand, he significantly expanded Russia. He laid the foundations of the future empire, centralized power in ways that would eventually allow later rulers, like Peter the Great, to modernize the country. On the other hand, he killed tens of thousands of his own people, destroyed entire cities, created a political culture where terror was an accepted tool of government, a culture that, in many ways, persisted for centuries in Russian history. The most famous painting of Ivan the Terrible shows him in the moment after striking his son. Painted by Ilya Repin in 1885, it captures the agony in the Tsar's eyes, the absolute despair of a man who has just destroyed the only thing he really loved. It is an image of Greek tragedy. A man who did everything to preserve his power and his dynasty, and ended up destroying both with his own hands. Ivan the Terrible died alone, feared, hated by many, lamenting the murder of his son until his last breath. The reign of terror he built did not survive a generation, but his name endured. As a warning, as an example of what happens when personal trauma meets absolute power, when fear rules instead of law. When a wounded child grows up without learning that strength and cruelty are not the same as true fortitude. Ivan IV was called Grozny in Russian. It is often translated as the Terrible, but the word can also mean the fearsome or the awe-inspiring. It carries a nuance of power that inspires awe as much as horror, and that is how Russia remembered him for centuries, not simply as a villain, but as a tragic and terrifying figure. A Tsar who could have been great, who was at moments, but who let his inner demons devour everything, including himself. The story of Ivan the Terrible is not just the story of a tyrant. It is the story of how unchecked power corrupts, of how unhealed trauma infects, of how a system based on violence perpetuates violence, and of how a kingdom built on fear eventually collapses under the weight of that same fear. Russia was not born as an empire. It was born of fear. The fear of an abandoned child who decided he would never be vulnerable again. And that fear became politics, law, death, until nothing remained but ashes and laments. And the question that persists: how much of Ivan the Terrible was created by Ivan himself, and how much was created by the world around him? Perhaps we will never know. But his story remains as a dark mirror, showing what we can become when we forget that power without humanity does not build empires. It only builds graves.